The lawyer's voice cut through the heavy silence of that Dallas conference room sharp as a gavel. Bradley grinned as his inheritance was read aloud, a sleek Miami penthouse worth millions. Caroline adjusted her pearl necklace, barely hiding her delight at the mention of her California estate. Then the lawyer turned to me, his tone unchanged, as if announcing something trivial. To Eleanor Whitman, a Singer sewing machine model, 1952. The air seemed to shift. My nephew smirked, my niece stifled a laugh. Even my sister Helen leaned back in her chair, lips pressed together pretending sympathy, while her eyes danced. A sewing machine. That was all I was worth to them, an antique reminder of a life they considered outdated, a woman they considered disposable. The room rippled with amusement at my expense, but what none of them knew, what even I didn't realize until later, was that this machine would become the very reason the FBI stormed into our lives. Before I take you deeper into this story, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated, laughed at, or treated as if you didn't matter? Where in the world are you watching this from? Share your thoughts below, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Because this story is only beginning, and trust me, you'll want to see where it leads. My name is Eleanor Whitman. I'm 67 years old, and until that day I lived quietly in a modest apartment outside Fort Worth. I spent 40 years teaching history to teenagers who barely remembered my name by graduation day. I never built a business empire or married into wealth. I never wanted to. But my family saw those choices as failures, branding me the odd relic in a dynasty obsessed with status. As I sat in that room, the walls lined with dark mahogany and oil paintings of men who looked like they had never lifted a hand in their lives, I felt the weight of their stares. Bradley, in his $1,000 suit, leaned back with the arrogance of youth and privilege. Caroline's husband, Senator Douglas, whispered something in her ear that made her laugh softly, like a politician's wife at a charity gala. And me. I sat clutching my worn handbag, dressed in the same navy blazer I had worn to every funeral, wedding, and courtroom appearance in the last decade. The laughter stung not because I cared about the money, though God knows retirement doesn't stretch far on a teacher's pension, but because the sewing machine felt like a public judgment. A verdict that said you were never part of this family's triumph, only its shadow. My mother, Mary Whitman, had built this empire with grit and brilliance. She taught me integrity mattered more than gold, yet now her legacy was being carved up like a feast I wasn't invited to share. Still, I held my tongue. Decades of silence had trained me well. But as the lawyer's words echoed, I caught something, just a flicker in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was caution. As though he knew this inheritance carried a weight none of them could see. And in that moment, humiliation gave way to something else. A question. Why a sewing machine? And what secret could possibly be sewn into its frame? I didn't know it yet, but my disgrace in that conference room was only the first thread. And when I pulled it, the whole tapestry of lies would begin to unravel. The conference room emptied slowly, like the end of a play where everyone knew their part. Bradley strutted out first, his phone glued to his ear, already arranging a celebratory dinner. Caroline followed close behind, whispering with her husband, Senator Douglas, about how quickly they could flip the California property into something even grander. Their laughter lingered in the hallway long after the door closed. I stayed seated for a moment, staring at the polished mahogany table that reflected the distorted shapes of those who had just claimed the lion's share. My reflection looked tired, older than I felt inside. But perhaps that's what years of silence does. It ages you in ways mirrors cannot hide. Helen. My youngest sister remained in her chair across from me. She had always been the performer of the family, the one who could step into a room and soak up attention like a sponge. Once upon a time, She sang in smoky lounges off Route 66, her voice carrying the ache of unfulfilled promises. Now, at 63, the glamour had faded, leaving only carefully painted lips and a wardrobe clinging desperately to the past. She leaned forward, placing a jeweled hand on mine. "Oh, Eleanor," she sighed, her voice dripping sympathy. "Mother must have thought the sewing machine would mean something special to you." I pulled my hand back gently, recognizing the act for what it was. Helen's sympathy had always been a performance, an audience was all she ever needed. "It means exactly what it looks like," I replied, standing. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Walking out into the marble-lined hallway, I could still hear Uncle Vernon's children Bradley and Caroline talking over each other about renovations, markets, returns. Their language was money, their faith was greed, and I was the relic, the poor sister who taught history while they made it. I cannot recall a single Christmas wedding or funeral in the last 30 years where I was not measured against them. When Bradley opened his first hedge fund at 25, relatives asked why I hadn't tried Wall Street. When Caroline married Douglas, the promising politician, my mother's friends whispered, "Why can't Eleanor find someone important?" And when I chose to stay in a classroom shaping lives invisible to society, they dismissed me as the charity case who had settled for less. But the truth they never understood is this teaching is not settling. It is standing guard over the fragile spark of knowledge in the next generation. They mistook humility for failure. They mistook silence for weakness. Senator Douglas glanced at me as we crossed paths by the elevators. He had that politician's smile, polished and hollow. "Eleanor," he said warmly, "if you ever need guidance, Caroline and I could help arrange a position. Maybe something in educational administration. Far better than wasting away in retirement, don't you think?" I forced a smile. "Thank you, Senator. But I've wasted nothing." His expression faltered for half a heartbeat before the mask returned. He joined Caroline, their heads bent together like conspirators plotting the next campaign. Helen caught up to me by the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "You should let them help Eleanor," she whispered. "They're powerful people. Don't make life harder on yourself." I turned to her, and for once I let the edge in my voice cut through. "Life has never been easy for me, Helen. And I've never asked them for a thing. Not when Dad died, not when Mother built her empire, and not now. I don't need their help. I need the truth." Her eyes flickered perhaps with curiosity, perhaps with fear. But she said nothing more. As I stepped out into the bright Texas sun, the air heavy with heat, I felt the weight of their scorn still pressing on me. They had written my role long ago, the quiet sister, the outdated aunt, the one who would never rise above. Yet standing there, clutching the small brass key the lawyer had slipped into my hand for the sewing machine, I knew something they did not. Their story wasn't finished, and neither was mine. The Whitmans had spent decades treating me like a shadow. But shadows lengthen at sunset. And when darkness falls, they often reveal more than light ever could. The sun burned against my skin as I stepped out of the law office, but the warmth did little to chase away the chill that had settled inside me. I held the brass key in my palm, its edges pressing into my skin, as if reminding me that the humiliation of that day was not the whole story. The family could laugh. The senator could offer me his hollow pity, but the truth was heavier than their inheritance, and I carried it alone. That key pulled me backward into memories I had tried to bury. Memories of my mother, Mary Whitman. She had been gone only a year, yet her presence was stitched into everything around me. The Whitman name, the properties, the empire, they were her creation. Not Vernon's, not Bradley's, not Caroline's. Hers. A woman widowed too young who stared down bankers in Dallas boardrooms when women weren't even allowed a seat at the table. She had built stone by stone, acre by acre, until the Whitman fortune stood taller than any skyscraper. But she was never just steel and business. At home, she was contradiction stern, yet gentle, sharp, yet endlessly loving. She scolded me for sloppy homework, then stayed awake with me on stormy nights, holding my hand until thunder passed. She carried her grief in silence after my father's death, but her eyes softened whenever she looked at me, as if I reminded her of what she had lost. And it was to me, not Bradley, not Caroline, that she whispered her truths in those final months. Sitting in her sunroom, her body frail from age and illness, she spoke words that would carve themselves into my soul. "Eleanor," she said, her voice thin but steady, "integrity lasts longer than money. Buildings fall, accounts vanish. But if you keep your soul intact, you leave behind something they cannot destroy." I had nodded, trying not to cry, trying not to imagine a world without her. At that time, I thought her lesson was only about survival. I didn't know it was also a warning. The last year of her life, I was by her side almost every evening. I brought her soup, helped her brush her thinning hair, and read aloud from the history books she had once teased me for loving. The others visited rarely, and when they did, their questions were always the same. "Have you updated the trust? Is the estate in order?" They circled her like vultures waiting for her signature more than her smile. She knew it. Of course she knew. And sometimes late at night her defenses slipped. She would take my hand, her fingers cool and trembling, and tell me fragments of secrets that felt more like riddles. "There's a garden," she whispered once, her gaze lost beyond the glass doors. "A place where roses never bloom. Some earth will not accept life, Eleanor. Remember that." I thought it was her illness speaking, just poetry from a dying mind. But now, standing in the shadow of that day's humiliation, the phrase returned like a bell tolling in my head. A garden where roses never bloom. Was it a metaphor? A warning? Or had she been pointing me toward something buried, something she could not say aloud? I pressed the key tighter in my hand. The sewing machine was only the surface. My mother was many things, but never careless. If she had chosen that as my inheritance, it was not by chance. I looked back at the glass doors of the law office where Bradley's laughter still echoed faintly. Let them laugh. They had inherited houses and wealth, but I had inherited her whispers, her trust, and perhaps her unfinished fight. And somewhere in a garden where nothing grew, I would begin to understand what my mother truly left. The phrase, "a garden where roses never bloom," followed me home like a shadow I couldn't shake. I carried the brass key and my humiliation back to my modest apartment, a place filled with books and the quiet clutter of a retired teacher's life. The sewing machine had been delivered earlier that day, tucked inside its black case, like a coffin waiting to be opened. I set it on my kitchen table, a table scarred with years of family dinners I once hosted long before greed split us apart. The case was heavier than I expected, the handle biting into my palm, as if reminding me that this weight was not only metal. It was memory. It was truth. When I unlatched the case, the machine gleamed under the soft glow of my overhead light. Singer spelled out in gold letters across polished black steel, perfectly preserved, as if time itself had been instructed to spare it. My breath caught when I noticed the paper wrapping still around the cord, unbroken, untouched. This machine had never sewn a single stitch. Why gift me something that had never been used? My mother had worked her fingers raw on her first singer. She told me once that with each stitch she mended, she sewed a piece of her independence back together. That machine was her weapon, her first taste of freedom. Yet this one had never even been threaded. It was a symbol, not a tool. I ran my hand along the base and felt a slight give, as though a panel didn't quite fit. My heart quickened. Years of teaching history had taught me that secrets hide best in the ordinary. I pressed against the tray where attachments should have been stored, and it shifted. Slowly, I lifted it free. Inside was a folded envelope sealed with wax, my name written across the front, in the familiar script of my mother's hand. My knees weakened, and I lowered myself into the chair before I dared to break the seal. The paper trembled in my grip as I unfolded the letter. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, then the vultures have already feasted, and laughter has already stung your heart. I could not protect you from their cruelty while I lived, but I can leave you the key to what they fear most, the truth." I read every word, my breath shallow, my hands clammy. The machine is only the beginning. Do you remember what I told you about the garden where roses never bloom? It is not barren by chance. Some soil rejects life because it holds death. Your father's death was no accident, Eleanor. Do not believe the story Vernon told. The answers lie where the earth refused to flower. Trust no one in the family. The combination you will need is your father's real birthday, not the one the records say. My love is with you always, Mother. I stared at the letter, its words blurring as tears welled in my eyes. My father. All my life, I had carried his absence like a scar I could not hide. They said he drowned in a boating accident off Galveston, a sudden storm catching him unprepared. I had mourned quietly, accepted it as one of life's cruelties, but my mother's words cut through that acceptance like a blade. Your father's death was no accident. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling both the weight of grief reborn and the spark of something sharper, anger. If what she wrote was true, then my family had done more than mock me. They had killed my father, stolen his life, and buried the truth beneath the soil of our empire. The sewing machine sat before me, silent and gleaming, no longer an object of shame. It was a weapon, a map. And for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of purpose. I looked out my window at the fading Texas sky, the colors bleeding into night. Somewhere in a garden that refused to bloom, my mother's secret waited. And so did justice. The letter trembled in my hand long after I had finished reading it. Sleep did not come that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the sewing machine still in front of me, the letter folded neatly beside it, and my mother's words echoing in my ears. The answers lie where the earth refused to flower. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. The old Whitman farm sat 30 miles outside Dallas, a forgotten property my mother had purchased decades ago when her empire was only a seedling. It had long since fallen into disuse, swallowed by weeds and silence. Developers had begged her to sell, but she always refused. She called it her sentimental land. At the time, I thought she meant it was simply a relic of her beginnings. Now, I wondered if it was a graveyard of secrets. The drive was quiet, Texas flatland stretching endlessly around me, the rising sun bleeding red across the horizon. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to. At 67, I thought I had outlived the years of recklessness, yet here I was driving alone to an abandoned property with a letter in my purse and suspicion in my heart. When I arrived, the iron gate leaned crooked rust eating through its hinges. I pushed it open, the screech breaking the silence of the morning. The driveway was cracked, sprouting wild grass through its fractures, nature reclaiming what wealth had once stamped down. The farmhouse sagged in on itself, windows-boarded roof sinking under decades of neglect. But I wasn't here for the house. I walked through the back field, my shoes crunching against brittle earth, until I reached it, the barren patch. It was smaller than I remembered, maybe 6 feet square, where no grass grew, no weeds dared spread, just raw, stubborn soil. I stood there, the wind whipping across the empty field, and felt the weight of my mother's voice. Some soil rejects life, because it holds death. I set down the small shovel I had brought, hands trembling as I pressed it into the dirt. The soil resisted at first, dry and compacted, but slowly it gave way. Shovel after shovel, sweat poured down my back despite the cool morning air. My breath came in sharp bursts, but I did not stop. Not until metal clanged beneath the blade. My heart lurched. Dropping to my knees, I brushed away the dirt with my hands, until a rusted corner of steel revealed itself. It was a box about the size of a briefcase, edges eaten with age, but still solid. A combination lock sat in the center of the lid. I sat back on my heels, wiping dirt across my face without caring. My pulse roared in my ears as I remembered my mother's words. Use your father's real birthday, not the one they told you. With shaking fingers, I spun the dials, 111571. The lock clicked open with a sound so sharp it cut through the wind. Inside the box was meticulously packed. Plastic protected the contents as if my mother had prepared for this discovery. I lifted the first bundle, yellowed documents, property deeds, and bank statements. Transfers upon transfers, money siphoned into names. I recognized Vernon Bradley, hidden behind shell companies. My stomach tightened as I realized what it meant, years of theft, orchestrated and deliberate. Beneath the papers lay photographs, black and white prints of men meeting in shadowed corners, grainy images of signatures on contracts, faces half-turned but unmistakable. And then something heavier, a cassette tape, its label handwritten in my father's bold scrawl. For Mary. The air left my lungs. My father's voice preserved on magnetic tape, waiting after all these years. I clutched it to my chest, trembling. It was as if the grave itself had spoken. The barren soil had guarded its secrets faithfully. Now they were in my hands, and I knew this was no longer just about inheritance or dignity. This was about life-death, and the truth my mother had trusted me alone to uncover. The steel box lay open across my lap, its secrets spilling into the pale light of the Texas morning. My hands moved through the papers, my breath catching with each page. Numbers, signatures, transfers, decades of theft recorded with the precision of a surgeon's cut. It was all there, in black and white. Vernon, my elder brother, the man who once swore to protect me after our father died, had instead been bleeding our mother dry. And Bradley, his son, my nephew, was no innocent heir. He had been his father's partner, funneling millions through shell companies in the Caymans, laundering it through real estate deals, even siphoning funds from charities our mother had once proudly championed. Each document was like a hammer blow pounding against the fragile walls of memory I had built to protect myself. I had spent years believing I was the family disappointment, the poor sister in a clan of titans. But now I saw the truth. It was not integrity that had made me an outcast. It was their corruption. I pushed the papers aside and picked up the cassette tape. My father's handwriting leapt from the label as alive as if he had just penned it yesterday for Mary. My fingers trembled as I slid it into an old tape player I kept tucked away in the trunk of my car, a relic from my teaching days when I still played history lectures on cassette. The tape whirred, and then his voice filled the air. "Mary," he said, weary but firm. "If you're hearing this, it means I've gotten too close. Vernon and Bradley are moving money. Millions. They're hiding it from you, from all of us. I've seen the records. I've confronted them, and now I think I'm being followed. They won't let me stop them. If anything happens to me on the water, don't believe it was an accident." I clutched the steering wheel as tears blurred my vision. My father's voice, carried across decades, reached into my chest and squeezed. He hadn't drowned in a storm. He had been silenced. The final blow came with the photographs at the bottom of the box. Grainy, taken with a long lens, but damning. Bradley meeting with a stocky man whose face I recognized from the local news, Marcus Torelli, a mechanic arrested more than once for sabotaging boats in insurance scams. There they were shaking hands outside a marina workshop just days before my father's so-called accident. The soil had given me proof of murder, but proof in my hands was not enough. I was a retired teacher, not a prosecutor. I needed someone who understood evidence, someone I could trust outside the poisoned tree of my family. That was when I thought of Frank Doyle. Frank had been a friend from long ago, a boy who used to carry my books home after school, later a detective who built his reputation on solving cases others buried. He had retired years back, living quietly on the outskirts of Dallas, his name occasionally surfacing in stories of cases that refused to die. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, but I knew where to find him, the VFW hall, where he spent Tuesday mornings playing cards with men who had seen too much of life to be easily surprised. I packed the documents, the photos, and the cassette into a plain satchel and drove straight there. When I walked in, the room smelled of stale coffee and pipe smoke. Frank sat at a corner table, his shoulders broader than I remembered, his hair thinner, but his eyes as sharp as ever. "Eleanor Whitman," he said, standing slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Haven't seen you since, God, it must have been that summer fair in '08. I set the satchel on the table, my voice low but steady. "Frank, I need your help. My family's been hiding something tied to my father's death, and I have proof." His smile faded. He pulled out a chair, motioning for me to sit. "Start talking," he said. And for the first time in my life, I began to tell someone the truth my family had spent decades trying to bury. Frank listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the satchel of evidence spread across the card table between us. When I finished, he leaned back slowly, his eyes hard. "Eleanor," he said, voice gravelly, "from too many years of smoke and secrets, what you've got here. It's not just family drama. This is federal. Fraud, laundering, conspiracy. And if your father's tape is what it sounds like, we're talking homicide." The word homicide landed heavy in my chest, colder than I'd expected. For years I had buried my doubts, swallowed the lies about storms and accidents. Now the truth stood naked before me. My father had been murdered, and his killers wore my family's name. Frank didn't waste time. The next morning we drove to the FBI Dallas field office, a squat glass building that looked unremarkable for the power it held. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed as agents passed us with files tucked under their arms. Frank introduced me to Agent Ramirez, a sharp-eyed woman whose handshake was firm enough to bruise. I laid out the documents, the photographs, and finally the cassette tape. As my father's voice spilled into the sterile conference room, the agent's expression shifted from skepticism to grim focus. She stopped the tape midway, pressing her palms flat on the table. "This is evidence of embezzlement, offshore laundering, campaign finance violations, and if corroborated, a premeditated killing," she said. "Mrs. Whitman, you realize what this means. We'll need you to testify. We'll need you to keep quiet while we move." I nodded, my throat dry. For decades, silence had been my curse. Now it would become my weapon. The Bureau opened the case within hours. Subpoenas were drafted, bank accounts traced, flight logs pulled. I watched as the machine of justice turned slow but unstoppable gears, grinding toward the truth. It didn't take long for the investigation to leak. Senator Douglas, with his polished smile and picture-perfect family, found himself at the center of a scandal when agents uncovered campaign donations funneled through Bradley's shell companies. The press circled like hawks headlines, screaming about corruption in high places. Caroline's face appeared on every channel, her pearls now symbols of greed instead of elegance. But the arrests, those were moments burned into my memory. Bradley was taken first. The FBI staged it at the country club where he played golf every Thursday, surrounded by friends who toasted his every victory. Agents waited until he lined up his putt on the 9th hole. The click of handcuffs cut through the manicured silence, his expensive club dropping to the grass. His friends stood frozen, their champagne glasses trembling as cameras captured the fall of a golden boy. Caroline's arrest came days later at a charity gala, draped in crystal chandeliers and hollow applause. She was stepping onto the stage to accept an award for philanthropy when the agents emerged from the shadows. Her smile cracked pearls, catching the light as her wrists were bound. The crowd gasped, a sea of sequins and tuxedos shifting into chaos as flashbulbs popped like gunfire. And Helen, my sister, the one who clung to pity as performance crumbled when she realized the truth. She had believed she was part of their circle, sharing in whispers and hand-me-down glamour. But the investigation showed she had been used, her name signed onto accounts she didn't understand, her presence leveraged as cover for their schemes. When the agents read her rights, she wept not for guilt, but for betrayal. I stood outside it all, watching the empire of my bloodline collapse under the weight of its own rot. The humiliation I had once felt at that mahogany table in Dallas seemed small now, almost laughable. They had laughed at me with their millions. Now the world laughed at them in chains. And yet beneath the satisfaction, grief lingered. This was my family, broken by greed, poisoned by ambition. Justice had a bitter taste. But it was justice all the same. For the first time in years, I felt my father's presence beside me, not as a ghost of sorrow, but as a witness to vindication. The courtroom was cold, not in temperature, but in spirit. For 6 long months, I sat through testimony cross-examinations and the endless parade of evidence that laid bare the rot of my family. I watched Bradley squirm in his tailored suits, Caroline faint once, when the evidence of campaign laundering was read aloud, and Vernon, the brother who had stolen not just money but our father's honor, sit stone-faced as if denial alone could hold back judgment. The verdicts came swift when they finally came. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and for Vernon and Bradley, complicity in my father's death. When the gavel fell, the sound cracked open something inside me. Not triumph, not joy. Something quieter. A release. The chains of silence I had carried for decades fell away. But justice wasn't finished. A week later, I was called back to the same law office where the humiliation had begun. the same mahogany table, the same city skyline. Only this time, the laughter was gone. Mr. Hutchinson, my mother's old lawyer, slid a new folder across the polished wood. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, his voice steadier. "Now your mother left an addendum to her will. It was sealed until the successful prosecution of the guilty parties." My hands shook as I opened it. The words were simple but life-altering. All assets, all properties, all holdings of the Whitman estate would revert to me. $50 million. The penthouse, the beach house, the accounts, they were never meant for Bradley or Caroline. They were a test, and they had failed. I closed the folder, tears welling not from greed, but from the weight of it all. My mother had trusted me to carry what mattered most, not wealth, but the truth. And now she had left me the tools to build something better. The weeks that followed blurred into decisions that felt both heavy and liberating. I founded the Mary Foundation in honor of my mother. Its mission was clear: to give dignity where families had stripped it away. We offered housing for elderly women abandoned in their final years, scholarships for first-generation students, and funding for whistleblowers who risked everything to expose corruption. Each dollar I spent felt like reclaiming a piece of the legacy Vernon and Bradley had tried to poison. The old Whitman farm, the place where I had unearthed the steel box, became a memorial garden. I restored the land, planting trees where weeds had claimed the soil. At the very center, on the barren patch where roses once refused to grow, I planted a single oak. Beneath it stood a plaque: "Truth grows where secrets are buried." And in my classroom, yes, I still visited my old school, unable to sever myself from the place where I had spent 40 years. I placed the sewing machine inside a glass case. It sat there, black and gold, untouched, but glowing with my mother's letter beside it. Students would pause curious, and I would tell them not about money or scandal, but about integrity. Sometimes I would say the smallest gifts carry the greatest power. A sewing machine can unravel a dynasty if you dare to look closer. The empire my family built on greed had collapsed. What remained was something stronger, a reminder that silence can end, truth can rise, and justice, though delayed, can still arrive. Looking back now, I realize my mother's greatest gift wasn't the fortune she left me, nor even the truth she preserved in steel and paper. It was the lesson she whispered in her last days: integrity lasts longer than money. And perhaps that is why she chose the sewing machine. Because sometimes the object that seems worthless, mocked, and dismissed is the very key that unlocks everything. Sometimes the smallest stitch unravels the grandest lie.